The cold arrived before the light did. Caleb Whitcomb sat with his back against the brick wall of a shuttered hardware store on Pearl Street, knees drawn to his chest, a coat, 2 sizes too large, hanging off his shoulders like something borrowed from a dead man. It was borrowed in a way, a coat Walt Briggs had aged with sandpaper and machine grease the night before, the same way he'd aged Caleb's boots, his hands the calendar of his face. 3 weeks of real cold and real hunger had done the rest. He hadn't slept. Not really. The wind came down off the lake and found every seam in his clothing, every gap between brick and pavement, and by 4 in the morning his teeth had stopped chattering, only because his jaw had gone numb from clenching it. He told himself this was the point. He told himself every year at this time. It never made the nights shorter. Burlington was waking up around him, delivery trucks groaning to life, a bakery 2 doors down, exhaling the smell of bread into air that still tasted like frost, when a man in a valet's red vest stopped mid-stride on the sidewalk and turned back slow, like he'd caught a familiar scent. "No," the man said, grinning. "No way." Caleb didn't look up. Looking up invited conversation, and conversation this early in this state was rarely kind. Caleb Whitcomb, Chestnut Street Caleb. The man crouched down uninvited, close enough that Caleb could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "Dale Pruitt. Come on, you remember me. Room 3 bunk under yours till they shipped you off to that next place." Caleb remembered him. He remembered the bruises Dale used to leave on smaller boys when the house parents weren't looking, and the particular cruelty of a child who had learned early that cruelty was the only currency anyone respected. "I heard you did something with money," Dale said, straightening up, addressing the sidewalk now, the 2 women waiting for a bus, anyone who'd listen. "Some kind of syrup company. Big deal. Rags to riches, they said. Guess the riches part was a rumor." He laughed, delighted with himself. "Look at you. Right back where you started. I always said it, some people you can dress them up, put them in a nice house, but they end up exactly where they belong. In the gutter. That's you, man. That's exactly you. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now? And which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. A woman at the bus stop shifted her bag away from Caleb without looking at him the way people avoid stepping in something. Caleb kept his eyes on the pavement between his boots. 30 years old, and for one long, ugly second he was 12 again, standing in a hallway that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, being told by a caseworker with tired eyes that no, he could not call his mother, that there was no number to call, that this was simply how things were now. Some people end up exactly where they belong. He had heard some version of that sentence his entire childhood in gentler and crueler forms, from people who had never once wondered whether it was true, or whether it was just easier to believe. He said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that silence cost less than an answer. Dale waited a moment for a reaction that didn't come, shrugged, and walked off toward wherever valets parked cars that weren't theirs, laughing once more for good measure before he turned the corner. The 2 women at the bus stop didn't laugh. They didn't help either. They simply looked away, the particular skill of people who have trained themselves not to see. Caleb pulled the coat tighter and did not cry, because he had promised himself years ago that he would not cry over Dale Pruitt or anyone like him, not ever again, not for anything. He only sat very still until the shaking in his chest passed for something the cold could take credit for instead. Across town, in a small stone chapel with white ribbons tied along every pew, the morning was unfolding very differently and very much the same. Vivian Ashford stood in front of a mirror in the church's back room while her stepmother Deborah fussed with a veil that didn't need fussing with, and her stepsister Dana scrolled through her phone with the particular boredom of someone who had already decided how the day would go. "He's just running late," Deborah said for the 4th time, though her voice had thinned considerably since the first. Vivian believed her for exactly 40 minutes past the ceremony's start time. She believed her through the murmuring in the pews, through the organist repeating the same 3 bars of processional music like a record stuck in a groove, through the pastor's increasingly gentle, increasingly worried glances toward the back doors. Her phone buzzed at 11 minutes past 11. "Found something better. Don't wait." 6 words. No name attached, though none was needed. Vivian read it twice, then a 3rd time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something survivable. They didn't. Well, Dana said not quite quiet enough, that's one way to find out. The whispering in the chapel had already curdled into something else by the time Vivian walked back out in her wedding dress, dry-eyed and pale, to tell the guests there would be no ceremony. Someone near the back let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Someone else reached for their coat before Vivian had even finished the sentence. Deborah's sympathy, what little of it there had been, evaporated the moment the guests began filing toward the doors, murmuring behind their hands. "Do you understand what you've done?" Deborah hissed, pulling Vivian aside by the elbow, her voice dropping to something sharp and low. "The Pierces were the best thing to ever happen to this family, and you managed to lose him before you even signed the papers." "I didn't lose anything, Deborah. He left. Because you gave him a reason to." Dana had drifted close, her arms crossed, delighting in the wreckage the way she delighted in most of Vivian's misfortunes. "Face it. You're not exactly easy to want, Vivian. Nolan was as good as it was ever going to get for you." She let the word settle, then added almost gently, as if it were a kindness, "You'll be lucky if the next man who looks twice at you is some beggar off the street. Honestly, that might be more your speed." The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Vivian didn't answer. There was nothing in her in that moment built to withstand an answer. She turned, gathered several pounds of white silk and lace into her fists, and walked straight past the reception tables. No one would need, past the gift table stacked with boxes that would all be returned by Monday, and out through the chapel's side door into a morning that had turned without anyone noticing to rain. She did not know, walking blindly down Church Street with her veil soaked flat against her back, and her borrowed shoes filling with water, that 3 blocks away a man in a stranger's coat was sitting against a brick wall, absorbing an insult of his own, still telling himself that some people did not in fact end up exactly where they belonged, that sometimes if a person was very lucky, or very brave, or simply had nowhere left to fall, the worst morning of their life turned out to be the one that led them somewhere they never expected to go. She kept walking toward Maple Street, and toward him without knowing either thing yet. Maple Street ran 3 blocks parallel to the lake, past a shuttered hardware store, a bakery just opening its doors, and the mouth of an alley, where a man in a stranger's coat had spent the better part of a rainy morning trying to disappear into the brick behind him. Caleb heard her before he saw her. Not words, not yet, just the strange, wrong rhythm of dress, shoes, and rain on pavement, a sound that didn't belong to this street or this hour. He looked up. A woman was coming toward him through the downpour in a wedding gown, the train dragging gray and heavy through the gutters, a veil plastered flat against her back like a broken wing. She wasn't sobbing. That was the thing that struck him first. Before the strangeness of the dress or the hour, she wasn't crying at all. Her face had the flat, glassy stillness of someone who had used up every tear she had and moved on to something quieter and more dangerous. He had seen that look before. He had worn it himself at 12 in a hallway that smelled like bleach. She stopped a few feet from him, chest-heaving, rain running in sheets off her chin, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Caleb became aware distantly of how he must look to her filthy coat, 3 weeks of beard hands cracked from cold, and some old, exhausted part of him braced for the same look Dale Pruitt had worn an hour earlier, the look that already knew what kind of man he was without needing to ask. It didn't come. She looked at him the way a person looks at the last available thing in a world that has just taken everything else away. "Were you left too?" she asked. Her voice was steady in a way that frightened him more than tears would have. "Ma'am, everyone." She laughed, short and wrong, more air than sound. "Everyone left me standing at the front of a church this morning. My whole family stayed just long enough to tell me exactly what I'm worth now, in case I hadn't already guessed." She wiped rain, or maybe not rain, from her cheek with the back of one hand, the diamond on her ring finger catching gray light for a second, before she seemed to notice it was there, and yanked it off, dropping it into the gutter without looking down. "They told me I'd be lucky if a beggar off the street ever looked at me again." Caleb went very still. He knew in the part of his mind that never fully stopped calculating that this was the kind of coincidence a smarter man would be suspicious of. He knew what his mother's face would have looked like hearing a line like that repeated back to her about her own son. He knew, too, in a place further down, that he had been sitting on this sidewalk for 3 weeks, specifically because he needed to know whether people who saw nothing but a ragged coat could still see a human being underneath it. And here now was a woman who had just been told, in the ugliest possible words, that she and men like the one she was looking at belonged to the same disposable category of person. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than the words could carry. "That's a cruel thing to say to somebody. Is it wrong, though?" She was looking at him very directly now, something wild and unmoored moving behind her eyes. Isn't that exactly what this is, you, me, both of us standing here with nothing left to lose? I don't know what happened to you this morning, Caleb said carefully, but you don't want to be doing whatever it is you're about to do. Marry me. The words hit the street between them and sat there absurd and enormous, while the rain kept falling as if nothing had been said at all. I'm not, Caleb started, and found he genuinely didn't know how to finish the sentence. I'm not who you think I am felt too dangerous. I'm not in a position to felt like a lie he wasn't yet ready to tell in either direction. You don't have to love me, she said quickly, the words tumbling out now cracked and fast like something breaking loose. I'm not asking you to love me. I just need. Her voice caught. For the first time since she'd rounded the corner, something in her composure slipped and he saw underneath it a kind of drowning. I need one person in this city to choose me. Just once. Just today. I don't care who you are or what you don't have. I have nothing either, not anymore. They made sure of that an hour ago. So marry me. Prove them wrong. Prove that anybody would rather have me than nothing at all. Caleb sat there in the rain and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. He thought of every year he had done this, the sidewalks, the shelters, the 3-week stretches of cold that never fully left his bones even months later, searching always for the same single thing, one person who would treat a man with nothing as though he still mattered. He had never once considered that the test might come looking for him instead, wearing a torn wedding dress, and asking a question with no safety net beneath it. He thought too of his mother, and of a version of himself at 12 that still lived somewhere under his ribs, the one who had learned that people leave, that promises made in warm rooms evaporate the moment the weather turns. He thought about how easy it would be right now in this rain on this street to give this drowning woman the one thing nobody had apparently given her all morning. Not money, not rescue, just a single unqualified yes. You don't know me, he said quietly. It was the only honest thing he had left to offer her. I know you didn't laugh, she said. I know you didn't walk away. Her whole body was shaking now from cold or grief or both. That's more than anyone else managed today. Somewhere behind them, half a block up, a black car sat idling at the curb, and inside it a man in an earpiece watched the scene unfold with his phone already halfway to his ear, waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. Caleb was aware of the car, the way he was aware of his own hands, present, controllable, irrelevant to the thing actually happening in front of him. All right, he heard himself say. Vivian blinked as if she hadn't fully expected the word to come even though she'd asked for it. All right, Caleb said again, steadier this time, and something in his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with 3 weeks of cold. I'll marry you. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain kept coming down around them, indifferent the way weather always is to the size of what's happening beneath it. Then Vivian did something that would stay lodged in Caleb's memory longer than almost anything else that year. She reached out, took his cracked, filthy hand in both of hers without hesitation, without flinching, and held it like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had come apart. That morning. Okay, she whispered, and for the first time since she'd rounded the corner onto Maple Street, she cried. Caleb Whitcomb, billionaire, orphan, liar by omission, sat in the rain and let a stranger hold his hand, and understood with a clarity that frightened him that whatever this was, it had already stopped being a test. The penthouse above Church Street had a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the lake, and Walt Briggs was standing in front of it with his arms crossed, when Caleb walked in, still wearing 3 weeks of grime and a stranger's coat. Do not, Walt said without turning around, tell me what I think you're about to tell me. Caleb closed the door behind him. Even after 18 years of friendship, of building a company together out of a single sapline and a used pickup truck, there were still moments when Walt could read him from the back of his own skull, and this was apparently one of them. I need you to hear the whole thing before you say anything, Caleb said. Walt turned around. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders in a way that had once been useful for hauling 40-gallon drums of sap up a hillside, and was now mostly useful for looming, which he did now, arms still crossed, eyes doing a slip, disbelieving pass over Caleb's ruined boots and unwashed hair. You look like something that crawled out from under a porch, Walt said. What happened? I got engaged. The silence that followed had weight to it. Walt's arms stayed crossed. His face went through several stages, confusion, the beginning of a laugh, and then as he registered that Caleb wasn't laughing either, something closer to alarm. You got engaged, Walt repeated slowly, to a woman you met 3 hours ago, while pretending to be homeless. On the same morning she got left at the altar by some other guy. He said it like he was reading it off a page and hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something sane. Caleb, tell me you hear how that sounds. I hear it. Then explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, this is the most reckless thing you've done since you decided to sleep in a bus shelter in February to see if anyone would bring you a blanket. Somebody did, Caleb said quietly. You remember. That's half the reason I keep doing it. That's not the point, and you know it. Walt uncrossed his arms and started pacing the way he did in board meetings when a number didn't add up and he intended to keep circling it until it did. You do this every year. 3 weeks no contact, you come back, you tell me whether the world's gotten any kinder, and then you go back to being Caleb Whitcomb and none of it costs you anything real. That's the deal. That's how it's worked for 8 years. This, he gestured at the door. At the city beyond it, at the whole shape of the morning Caleb had just described, this is different. This has a marriage license attached to it. I know what it has attached to it. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, a woman finds out somehow, some way. Doesn't matter how, that the beggar she proposed to on a dare is actually worth more than most zip codes in this state, and suddenly you've got a wife, with a lawyer and half of Whitcomb Maple in a divorce settlement. That's not paranoia, Caleb, that's Tuesday. That's what happens to men like you. She doesn't know who I am. Everybody says that right up until they do. Caleb crossed to the window and looked out at the lake, gray and choppy under a sky that hadn't decided whether it was done raining. He thought about the way Vivian's hands had felt closing around his, not careful, not calculating, just desperate and human, and shaking with cold that had nothing to do with the weather. You didn't see her face, Walt. I don't need to see her face. I've seen 100 faces. That's the job. That's why you keep me around instead of doing all this yourself, because you get out there and you start believing in people again inside of 48 hours every single time, and somebody has to be the one asking the ugly questions after. Walt's voice had dropped, lost some of its heat, gone into the register he used when he actually meant something instead of just arguing it. I'm not trying to be cruel. I know what this test is really about for you. I know it's not really about maple syrup or business ethics or whatever you tell the board when they ask why the chairman disappears every spring. I know exactly whose voice you're listening for out there every time you sit down on some sidewalk in the cold. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. Walt had been there the year Ruth Whitcomb died, had sat with a 12-year-old Caleb in a county waiting room that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, had watched him get shuffled from one placement to another with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes, and a look on his face that Walt had never entirely forgotten. Walt knew better than almost anyone alive what Caleb was actually testing every time he put on a stranger's coat. It was never really about the money. It was about whether the world this time might behave differently than it had the last time he had nothing. That's exactly why I'm worried, Walt said softer now. Because you want this to be real so badly that you're not going to see it clearly if it isn't. And I've watched you build something out of nothing once already, Caleb. I'm not going to sit here and watch somebody take it apart because you needed one stranger one time to look at you the way your mother used to. It landed harder than Walt probably intended, and for a moment Caleb's jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I'm not asking your permission, Caleb said. I know you're not. I'm your friend, not your board of directors. But I am asking you for 3 weeks. Let me look into her. Quietly. Just enough to know she's not connected to anybody who'd want to hurt you, that this isn't a setup, that there's no ex-boyfriend or business rival standing behind this whole thing with a camera rolling. Walt held up both hands before Caleb could object. That's it. That's all I'm asking. If she's exactly who she looks like, some woman having the worst morning of her life who happened to say yes to the wrong man at the wrong moment, then fine. I'll stand next to you at whatever ceremony you decide to have, and I won't say another word about it. But you owe me 3 weeks before you hand your whole life to a stranger the same way I've earned every year we've built this company together. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching a gull ride the wind sideways over the water. Her name's Vivian, he said finally. Vivian Ashford. Walt exhaled some of the tension, leaving his shoulders now that he had a name to work with, something concrete instead of the shapeless dread that had been sitting in his chest since Caleb walked through the door. Okay, he said. Vivian Ashford. I'll start there. Walt. Caleb turned from the window, and for the first time since he'd come in, something raw showed through the exhaustion on his face. Whatever you find, I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's not what I want to hear. Especially then. You know I will. Walt clapped a hand on his shoulder, the old gesture, the one that had meant we're in this together since they were 17 years old and neither of them had 2 dimes to rub together. That's the job. Somebody's got to keep both feet on the ground while you go around testing the whole world's capacity for kindness. He didn't say the rest of what he was thinking, that some part of him already dreaded what 3 weeks of digging might turn up, not because he expected to find a con artist, but because he had a bad feeling, low and old and unspecific, that whatever he found was going to matter a great deal more. than either of them was prepared for. It took Walt Briggs 11 days to find the clipping. He had started, as he always did, with the obvious channels: public records, employment history, the diner where Vivian Ashford had worked until the scandal cost her the job, a handful of old classmates willing to talk for the price of a coffee. Nothing raised a flag. No hidden fiancé, no outstanding debts under her own name, no pattern of behavior that looked like a con being run in slow motion. If anything, the picture that emerged was almost aggressively ordinary. A woman who tipped well when she had nothing to tip with, who'd once walked 4 blocks in the snow to return a stranger's dropped wallet, who had, by every account, Walt could find spent her whole life being kinder to people than they were to her. It was the ordinariness that eventually led him somewhere unordinary. He was cross-referencing an old address, a walk-up apartment Vivian's family had lived in before her father died, when a digitized copy of the local paper's archive surfaced a photograph he almost scrolled past. A community fundraiser, a decade-old, grainy and small, run beneath a headline about a hospital's cancer ward struggling to cover treatment costs for patients without insurance. In the photograph, a teenage girl stood beside a glass donation jar outside a grocery store, her coat too thin for the season, holding up a hand-lettered sign. Walt almost closed the tab. Then his eye caught the caption beneath the photo, and the caption caught a name he recognized from somewhere far older and far more painful than 11 days of research. 16-year-old Vivian Ashford empties her entire summer's babysitting earnings into the Whitcomb Fund, established in memory of local mother Ruth Whitcomb to help cover treatment costs for patients like her. He read it 3 times before the words fully landed. He sat very still in his office for a long moment, the city noise outside the window suddenly very far away, and then he picked up his phone and called Caleb with hands that were not entirely steady. Caleb was in the boardroom at Whitcomb Maple when the call came through, reviewing quarterly projections with 2 vice presidents who had no idea their chairman had spent the last 3 weeks sleeping in doorways. He stepped out into the hallway to take it, and something in Walt's voice, clipped careful wrong, made him close the door behind him before Walt had said more than a sentence. "I need you to sit down," Walt said. "I'm in a hallway, Walt." "What is it?" "Your mother, Ruth." Walt's voice cracked slightly on the name, which was unlike him, which made the back of Caleb's neck go cold before he understood why. There was a fund, after she was diagnosed before the end. A community fund to help with the costs the insurance wouldn't cover. "Do you remember it?" Caleb remembered it the way a person remembers a wound that never fully closed. 11 years old, sitting in a folding chair outside a grocery store, his mother could no longer walk to on her own, watching strangers drop change into a jar with his mother's name printed on a poster board sign, feeling the particular, complicated shame of a child who understands dimly that his family has become a thing people pity in public. "I remember," he said. "There's a photograph from that fund. A girl 16 years old emptying an entire summer of babysitting money into that jar." Walt paused, and in the pause, Caleb could hear him steadying himself before he said the rest. "Caleb, it's her. It's Vivian. The caption has her name in it." For a moment, Caleb didn't say anything at all. The hallway around him, the framed photographs of maple groves, the low hum of the building's climate system, 2 assistants walking past with tablets under their arms, all of it seemed to recede into something very far away, replaced by a memory he hadn't let himself sit inside of in years. His mother, thin by then, wrapped in a coat that had once fit her properly, thanking a line of strangers one by one, with a gratitude so pure it had embarrassed 11-year-old Caleb at the time because he hadn't yet understood what it cost. A proud woman to accept charity in public. "The donation came late," Walt said quietly. "I checked the dates against the treatment records your lawyer pulled after everything. It arrived about 2 weeks after she'd already passed." "I'm sorry, Caleb. I know that's not the ending either of us wanted to find." Caleb leaned back against the hallway wall and closed his eyes. He had spent years quietly, privately, in a way he had never fully admitted, even to Walt, trying to find some trace of the people who had put money into that jar. Not because it would have changed anything. His mother was gone regardless of whether the check had cleared in time. But because somewhere in the wreckage of losing her a smaller, more specific grief had lodged itself in him. The grief of never being able to say thank you to the strangers who had tried uselessly and too late to save a woman he loved. He had told himself more than once that the search was foolish, that it changed nothing, that he should let it go the way he'd learned to let go of so much else. He had never quite managed it, and now, without looking for her at all, without any plan or intention, he had found the anonymous girl standing on a rain-soaked street corner 3 weeks ago, holding out a hand to a man she believed had nothing, and asking him to marry her. "Caleb." Walt's voice careful now, testing the silence. "You still there?" "She doesn't know," Caleb said, and his own voice came out rougher than he expected. "She has no idea who I am. She has no idea that Jar ever mattered to anyone specific, let alone." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence out loud. "No," Walt agreed. "I don't think she does. I think she was just a 16-year-old kid who saw a family in trouble and gave everything she had and then went on with her life and probably never thought about it again." Caleb pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, standing alone in a hallway lined with photographs of the empire he'd built out of nothing, and felt something inside his chest give way in a manner that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with a kind of astonished, disbelieving gratitude he did not have adequate language for. "I've been looking for her for years," he said, finally, so quietly Walt had to strain to hear it. Not her specifically. Just whoever that was. Whoever put money in that jar and tried to help a family they'd never met. "I used to think if I ever found them I'd know what to say. Turns out I don't have a single word." "You don't have to say anything to her about it," Walt said gently now, all his earlier suspicion folded away somewhere beneath the weight of what he'd just handed his oldest friend. "Not yet. Maybe not ever if you don't want to. But Caleb, for what it's worth, this doesn't look like a woman running a con. This looks like the same kind of person she was at 16, still giving away things she can't afford to lose, still not knowing what any of it will cost her." Caleb didn't answer right away. Down the hall, through a half-open door, he could hear the low murmur of the boardroom waiting for him to return quarterly numbers and expansion plans and all the ordinary machinery of a life he had built brick by brick out of the wreckage of the one he'd lost at 12 years old. None of it in that moment felt like it weighed anything at all against the fact sitting in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. The woman who had proposed to him in the rain, believing him to be a stranger with nothing, had already once tried to save the only family he'd ever had, and had never once known it mattered. "Don't tell her," Caleb said finally. "Not yet. I want to know her as who she thinks I am a little longer before either of us finds out what we actually owe each other." A few days after Walt's call, the rain finally let up, and with it came a strange, suspended kind of quiet over Burlington. The sky scrubbed pale, the lake gone flat, and silver the whole city, acting as if it had forgotten how loud the week before had been. Vivian found Caleb in the same spot most evenings now, though she'd stopped thinking of it as finding him and started thinking of it without quite admitting it to herself as visiting him. She brought what she could, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper from the diner that no longer employed her, a thermos of coffee she'd learned. He took black, no sugar, the same way her father used to. She never asked him where he went during the day, and he never offered. There was an unspoken agreement between them that certain doors stayed closed a little longer. That evening she found him sitting not against his usual wall but on the low stone steps of a small park 2 blocks over, elbows on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. Something in the set of his shoulders made her slow her steps before she reached him. "You're somewhere else tonight," she said, settling down beside him close enough that their sleeves touched. "Just thinking." He didn't look at her right away. "About a street I used to live on. Here in Burlington. Different town. Different life feels like." He turned the thermos cup over in his hands without drinking from it. "There was a house on Chestnut Street. Group home. 8 boys to a room some years, 6 the good years. I ended up there when I was 12 after my mother died, and I stayed until I aged out at 18. Vivian went very still beside him, sensing correctly that he had never said this out loud to anyone in this particular way before, not as fact, not as history, but as something still bleeding underneath the words. The man who ran it, everyone called him Mr. Hollis, never a first name. Not once in 6 years he had this way of lining you up on your first morning and telling you exactly where you stood. Caleb's voice had gone flat, careful, the voice of a man walking across ice he didn't trust. He'd look you over like you were a piece of furniture somebody dropped off that he now had to find room for. And he'd say the same thing every time to every kid who came through that door. Nobody keeps you because they want you. They keep you because somebody's paying for you to be kept. Remember that. And you won't waste your life waiting for anybody to prove different. That's a horrible thing to say to a child. It's an efficient thing to say to a child. Caleb's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. It stops them from hoping. Hollis used to say hope was the most expensive thing a kid in that house could afford, and he wasn't running a house for kids who could afford things. Vivian reached over without quite deciding to, and put her hand over his on the thermos cup. He didn't pull away, but she felt him go rigid for a moment, the way a person does when they're bracing for the next part of a story to hurt worse than the first. "My mother," he said, "slowly died when I was 12. Cancer. Fast once. It started fast enough that I barely understood what was happening before it was already over. And for the longest time, longer than I want to admit, I believed the story the county gave me about it. That she couldn't manage at the end. That there'd been some arrangement, some paperwork that made it sound like she'd chosen to let me go rather than keep fighting to keep me. He said it evenly, like a fact he'd repeated to himself so many times it had worn smooth, lost its edges, become almost bearable. I spent 6 years in that house telling myself Hollis was right, that nobody keeps you because they want you. I figured if my own mother hadn't wanted to keep fighting for me, there wasn't much reason to expect anyone else would either. Caleb. Vivian's voice cracked slightly on his name the first time she'd said it since he'd started talking, though he hadn't noticed until just now how much he'd wanted to hear her say it. I'm so sorry. I've never told anyone that, he said, and there was something almost startled in his own voice, as if the confession had surprised him on its way out. Not like that. Not the whole thing start to finish. Not even, she hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without prying into the parts of his life he still kept locked. Not even someone close to you, a friend. My best friend knows the shape of it. The dates, the facts. Caleb finally looked at her, and something in his expression was rawer than she'd seen from him, yet stripped of whatever careful composure he usually carried. But there's a difference between someone knowing what happened to you and someone knowing what it did to you. I've kept those two things separate my whole life. Seemed safer that way. And tonight you didn't. Tonight I didn't, he agreed quietly, like he was still working out why. For a while neither of them said anything. The park around them had gone the particular hush of early evening streetlights flickering on one by one along the path, a dog barking somewhere off in the distance, and then falling silent. Vivian didn't try to fill the quiet with reassurance, didn't reach for any of the easy things people say to make pain smaller than it is. I'm sure your mother loved you. I'm sure it wasn't really like that. Sure, things worked out for a reason. She had learned, this past week, from a man in a stranger's coat, that some silences were kinder than any words that might fit inside them. She simply stayed sitting next to him, her hand still over his on the thermos cup, until the shaking in his shoulders so slight she might have imagined it, except that she hadn't settled into something quieter. I used to think I was broken in some specific way, Caleb said, finally so low she had to lean in slightly to catch it. Like there was a piece missing, that other people had the piece that makes you worth keeping. I built a whole life trying to prove I wasn't broken. Worked myself half to death proving it actually. And somewhere in the middle of all that proving, I forgot to ever ask myself whether it was even true to begin with. It isn't, Vivian said simply. For what it's worth. From someone who's known you 3 weeks and has absolutely no reason to be kind to you except that I want to be. She squeezed his hand once, firm grounding. You're not broken, Caleb. You're just carrying something nobody ever helped you put down. He looked at her for a long moment in the fading light. This woman who had walked into his life soaked to the bone in a torn wedding dress, who had nothing left to give anyone, and kept giving it anyway, and felt something shift in his chest that had been locked in place since he was 12 years old. Not fully open, not yet, but unlatched for the first time in 18 years by someone who had asked for nothing in return except the truth. Nobody's ever said that to me before, he admitted. Then it was overdue, Vivian said, and rested her head against his shoulder, and neither of them moved again for a long time, while the streetlights buzzed to life above them, and the whole ordinary city went on around two people who had just, without either fully realizing it, begun the slow work of trusting each other with something real. A few weeks passed, and Burlington, as small cities do, found other things to talk about. A downtown fire, a mayoral scandal, a missing dog that turned up 2 towns over but never quite let go of Vivian Ashford entirely. Her name had become a kind of shorthand at the diner counters and the church coffee hours where she used to belong, a story people told with a particular flavor of relish, reserved for other people's ruin. There she is, said a woman Vivian didn't recognize loud enough to carry. As Vivian walked past the farmer's market with a paper bag of day-old rolls she'd talked the bakery into giving her for free. The one who proposed to the vagrant on Church Street. I heard she brings him lunch every day now. Like a stray dog. Vivian kept walking. She had gotten better in 3 weeks at keeping walking. It was harder at the diner, where she still had a few shifts left before the owner, a soft-spoken man named Ed who'd known her since she was in pigtails, finally called her into the back office with an apology already loaded into his face before he'd said a word. I've had 6 phone calls this week, Ed told her, not quite meeting her eyes. Customers saying they'll take their business elsewhere if the girl who's engaged to that homeless fellow keeps working the counter. I don't believe a word they're saying about you, Vivian. I want you to know that. But I've got a business to run, and I can't lose 6 families' worth of breakfast money over gossip. So you're firing me. I'm asking you to take a little time off. Paid for now. Ed's mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. Till this dies down. They both knew it wasn't going to die down, not on its own, and they both knew what paid for now would quietly become once the register started running short. Vivian thanked him anyway because there was nothing to be gained from making Ed feel worse than he already did, and walked out of the diner with her apron folded under her arm like something she was returning rather than surrendering. She didn't tell Caleb that night. She told herself it was because it wasn't the kind of thing you brought to a man who had nothing of his own to offer back, but some smaller, more honest part of her knew it was because she wasn't ready yet to watch his face rearrange itself into pity. She had had enough of pity to last a lifetime. Deborah found other ways to make her opinion known. She showed up at Vivian's apartment on a Tuesday evening, unannounced, wearing the particular expression she reserved for conversations she considered beneath her, but necessary, mouth-pinched eyes doing a slow, disapproving sweep of the small living room as if the furniture itself were somehow implicated in her stepdaughter's poor decisions. "I spoke to a lawyer," Deborah said without preamble, setting her purse down on the kitchen table like she owned it. "About the engagement." There's nothing to speak to a lawyer about, Deborah. There's no contract. There's no property. There's a man and a promise, that's all. That's precisely the problem. A promise made in the street to a man nobody can even properly name. Deborah's voice climbed half a register the way it always did when she was building towards something. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to this family? Dana's been dropped from 2 committees this month. 2. Because people are asking whether the Ashford name means anything anymore now that the younger daughter's engaged herself to a man sleeping in doorways. His name is Caleb. His name is irrelevant." Deborah's hand came down flat on the table, sharp enough to make the salt shaker jump. "What's relevant is that you had a good man, Vivian. A wealthy man, a respectable man, ready to take care of you for the rest of your natural life. And you let him walk away over some scene you made afterward, parading around town in a torn dress like a tragedy. Nobody asked you to perform. Nolan left me at the altar, Deborah. I didn't make a scene. I survived one. And instead of surviving it quietly with some dignity, you went and attached yourself to the first man low enough to say yes to you. Do you understand how that reads to people? It confirms every unkind thing anyone's ever said about you. That you'll take whatever scraps are offered because you don't believe you're owed anything better." The words landed the way Deborah's words always landed, precisely, deliberately aimed at the exact place they'd do the most damage. Vivian had spent 20 years learning the shape of her stepmother's cruelty well enough to see it coming, and still somehow never well enough to stop it from finding its mark. "Get out," Vivian said quietly. "Excuse me." "I said get out, Deborah." Her voice was steady, steadier than she felt, but it held. "You don't get to come into my home and tell me what I'm worth. You've been doing that since I was 7 years old, and I am done letting you." Deborah's mouth opened, then closed, some flicker of surprise moving across her face at the unfamiliar sight of her stepdaughter refusing to fold. She gathered her purse with exaggerated dignity, paused at the door as if she might say something final and devastating, and then apparently thought better of it, leaving instead with only the sharp click of her heels against the floor to punctuate her exit. Vivian stood alone in her small kitchen for a long time after the door shut, hands braced against the counter, breathing slowly, willing, the shaking in her chest, to settle the way she'd watched Caleb will his own shaking to settle a dozen times now on cold nights on street corners in the particular silence of 2 people who had each learned separately that some pain doesn't announce itself with tears. That evening she found him where she always found him now, and did not mention Deborah or the diner or any of it. Instead, she sat down beside him with 2 cups of coffee she'd bought with money she could no longer easily spare, and asked him the way she'd started asking most evenings, small, ordinary questions that had nothing to do with tragedy. What his favorite season was, whether he'd ever. He learned to swim in the lake as a kid, what he thought about the geese that kept congregating, loud and indignant on the green space near the water. "I used to hate the cold," Caleb said, wrapping both hands around the paper cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "Now I think I understand it better than most people do. Cold's honest, at least. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. That's a strange thing to find comforting. Most true things are strange to find comforting." He glanced sideways at her, something gentler than she'd seen from him before moving across his face. "You didn't smile once when you got here tonight. You're usually better at hiding it than that." Vivian considered lying. She'd gotten good over the years at deciding what to hide and from whom, and some old instinct told her a man with nothing shouldn't have to carry the weight of a woman's bad day on top of his own. "I lost my job," she admitted, instead surprising herself. "A few days ago. Not officially. Officially, I'm taking some time. Unofficially, half my customers didn't want to be served by the woman who's engaged to a man they call a vagrant." She waited for the pity she'd been dreading. It didn't come. Instead, Caleb went very quiet, his jaw tightening in a way she was beginning to recognize as something closer to fury than sadness, carefully banked. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That's my fault in a way I don't know how to fix yet. It's not your fault. It's everyone else's fault for treating kindness like a punishable offense." She bumped her shoulder gently against his. "I'd do it again if you're wondering. Every single time. I didn't propose to you because I had nothing left to lose, Caleb. I think I've figured out these last few weeks that I proposed to you because some part of me already knew you were worth losing things for." He didn't answer right away. He simply reached over, took her hand the way she had once, on a rain-soaked street, taken his and held it there in the gathering dark, while the geese complained at the water's edge, and the whole complicated, unfair city carried on, around two people who were slowly and without either of them, fully naming it yet falling in love with each other exactly as they were. One with nothing visible left to give, and one who had already decided that was never the part that mattered. The envelope in Vivian's coat pocket had been there for 2 days before she found the courage to hand it over. It wasn't much by any ordinary measure, $4,100, the remains of a savings account she'd been building since she was 22, meant originally to cover the deposit on an apartment she and Nolan were never going to share, then repurposed in the wreckage of the wedding that wasn't into something vaguer and more desperate, a cushion against whatever came next. She had counted it twice the night before, sitting cross-legged on her kitchen floor with the bills spread out around her like a hand of cards she didn't know how to play, and had arrived both times at the same uncomfortable arithmetic. It was everything she had. It would not go very far, and she was going to give it away anyway. She found Caleb where she always found him, on the low stone steps near the water, the evenings settling gold and cold around them the way it did more and more now that autumn had properly arrived. He looked thinner than he had 3 weeks ago, though she'd started bringing him what food she could afford, and there was a new stillness to him some nights, as if he were holding something carefully behind his ribs and hadn't decided yet whether to let it out. "I need to give you something," she said before she could talk herself out of it, and pressed the envelope into his hands before he could ask what it was. Caleb opened it slowly. She watched his face change as he counted, watched the practiced blankness he usually wore in public fall away into something raw disbelief first, and then unmistakably something that looked almost like grief. "Vivian." Her name came out rough. "This is everything you have. I know what it is. You can't." He was already trying to hand it back, and she folded her arms so there was nowhere for him to return it to. "You lost your job 3 weeks ago. You should be holding on to every dollar of this, not handing it to a man sleeping in doorways." "I've thought about that. I thought about it all night, actually." She sat down beside him close enough that their knees touched and looked out at the lake instead of at him, because it was easier to say true things to water than to a face. "My mother used to tell me that money you're afraid to lose was never really yours to begin with. It was just fear wearing a number. I spent my whole engagement to Nolan terrified of losing money I didn't even have yet. Terrified of losing a house, a name, a life I thought I was owed if I just stayed quiet enough and smiled at the right dinners." She turned to look at him now. "I don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want to be the kind of person who only gives when it's safe. This isn't safe. This is reckless. Maybe. But it's mine to be reckless with." She reached over and closed his hands around the envelope, holding them there a moment longer than she needed to. "Get yourself somewhere warm. A room, real food, whatever you need to stand back up on your feet. That's all I'm asking it to buy. I'm not asking for anything back." Caleb sat very still, the envelope trapped between both their hands, and for a long moment he didn't trust himself to speak. He had over the course of his adult life been handed enormous sums of money by bankers, investors, board members eager to be associated with his name, had shaken hands over numbers with more zeros than this small crumpled envelope could ever hold. And none of it, not one single dollar of it, had ever once made his chest feel like it was cracking open the way it did now. He thought of the hospital jar. He thought of a 16-year-old girl standing outside a grocery store in a coat too thin for the season, emptying a summer's worth of babysitting money into a jar with his dying mother's name on it, asking for nothing. Back then either. He understood with a clarity that frightened him that he was watching the same act of unguarded generosity happen twice in one lifetime, aimed at him twice by the same woman 11 years apart, and that she had no idea either time what it would come to mean to him. "You don't know what this is," he said finally, and his voice had gone unsteady in a way he rarely allowed it to. "What this actually is to someone who's had almost nothing handed to him without a price attached his whole life." "I don't need to know what it is to you," Vivian said gently. "I just need to know it's true." That's all generosity ever really requires, I think. Not a reason, just honesty. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had given away her wedding, her reputation, her job, and now the last of her savings in the space of a single autumn, without asking a single time whether any of it made sense, and felt something in him, some old guarded, carefully bricked up part of like himself begin very quietly to come undone. I have to tell you something, he said. Not everything, not yet, but something. Vivian that went very still beside him, some instinct warning her that whatever was coming mattered more than the ordinary confessions they'd traded so far. When my mother was sick, Caleb said slowly, choosing each word like it cost him something to spend it, there was a fund. A community jar outside a grocery store to help cover what the insurance wouldn't. I used to sit next to it some afternoons, 12 years old, watching strangers drop in whatever they could spare. Most people gave a few dollars. Some gave nothing at all and just looked embarrassed walking past. But I remember I've never forgotten there was one afternoon a teenage girl came by and emptied an entire jar of her own into ours. Everything she had. I never learned her name. I never got the chance to thank her. Vivian's breath caught some faint, unformed recognition stirring in her that she couldn't yet place, though the shape of the story felt strangely uncomfortably close to something she remembered from her own life, from years ago, from a version of herself who used to stand outside the grocery store on Church Street with a coffee can and a handwritten sign. I think about her sometimes, Caleb went on, watching the water instead of her face, now unable to look at her directly while he said it. I think about how she never knew whether it mattered, whether it helped, whether anyone ever even noticed. He turned to face her fully then, and something in his eyes was so unguarded, so exposed, that Vivian felt her own chest tighten in response. I need you to know that gestures like that, the kind you just handed me, the kind that costs the person giving it everything, and asks for nothing back, they don't disappear, Vivian. They land somewhere. They matter more than the person giving them usually ever finds out. Caleb. Her voice had gone very quiet. Why does that story sound so familiar? He almost told her right then. The confession sat on his tongue, fully formed, ready to be spoken, because it's you, Vivian. It was always you. I've spent 11 years wondering who you were, and you've been standing next to me for 3 weeks, and for a single, suspended moment. The whole truth hovered between them, close, enough to touch. But something in him, some old habit of caution 18 years in the making, pulled the words back at the last second. Small towns, he said, instead, softer than he meant to. I imagine there are jars like that outside every grocery store in Vermont one year or another. Probably more girls like her than either of us will ever know about. Vivian let it go, though something in her wouldn't quite stop turning the coincidence over, quiet and unresolved, in the days that followed. She had no way yet of knowing how close she had come to the truth, sitting on those stone steps with the last of her savings pressed into a stranger's hands, giving away everything a second time without ever learning until much later that she had already given it once before. The offices of Whitcomb Maple occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse on the waterfront, all exposed brick and reclaimed timber. The kind of building magazine photographers love to shoot for stories about self-made success. Caleb rarely used the executive suite on the top floor anymore, preferring a smaller office 1 level down where the noise of the sugar house operations 2 states away still felt, at least in his imagination, close enough to reach. He was there past midnight, 3 days after Vivian had pressed her savings into his hands, when Walt found him standing at the window with the lights off, watching the harbor lights ripple on black water. You're supposed to be asleep, Walt said, setting 2 coffees down on the desk. Or at least pretending to be homeless, somewhere less comfortable than this. Couldn't sleep. Yeah, well. Walt handed him one of the cups and settled into the chair across the desk. The old familiar posture of 2 men who'd spent 18 years having their most important conversations at odd hours. I've got a list. You want the easy part first, or the part that's going to make you do that thing with your jaw? Easy part. The Ashford family orchard. Vivian's father owned it before he died. Small operation, maybe 12 acres, a few hundred trees. Nothing that would ever compete with us commercially, but it was theirs. Family land, 3 generations. They lost it to back taxes and medical debt about 6 years ago, sold at auction to a holding company that's been sitting on it ever since, doing nothing with it. Walt slid a folder across the desk. I can have it bought back, and the title transferred inside of 2 weeks. Quietly, through a shell entity so it doesn't trace back to you. Caleb opened the folder, scanning the photographs of an overgrown sugar bush, sap lines gone slack, and unused a small farmhouse with boarded windows standing at the property's edge, like something waiting to be forgiven. Do it, he said. Put it in her name outright. No liens, no conditions, nothing she'd ever have to pay back even if she wanted to. She's going to ask where it came from eventually. Then we'll figure that out eventually. For now, just get it done. Caleb closed the folder, something tight in his chest easing slightly at the thought of Vivian someday, standing on land that had once been her father's, without ever needing to know the hand behind it at least. Not yet. Not until he'd found a way to tell her everything else first. What's the part that's going to make me do the jaw thing? Walt was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the desk, and Caleb recognized the particular hesitation of a man deciding how to deliver something he didn't want to deliver at all. I went back through Nolan Pierce's financials, Walt said finally. You asked me to find out why a man walks away from his own wedding without a word, and I found an answer, but it's not the one I expected. Go on. 9 days before the ceremony, $40,000 moved into an account belonging to Nolan Pierce. Wire transfer clean on paper labeled as a gift. Walt slid a second folder across this one thinner. The money came from an account belonging to Deborah Ashford. Caleb went very still. Vivian's stepmother, he said, slowly paid her own daughter's fiancé $40,000. 9 days before he left her stepdaughter at the altar. That's what the records show. Walt leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I don't have the full picture yet. I don't know if it was meant as some kind of dowry, an incentive hush money for something else entirely. I haven't been able to trace the reasoning, only the transaction. But the timing's not a coincidence, Caleb. 9 days before the wedding is not a random moment for that kind of money to move. And Nolan took the money and left anyway. Looks that way. Found himself a better offer somewhere else probably, and figured $40,000 was a fine consolation prize for standing a woman up on the worst day of her life. Walt's mouth had gone tight, some old protective anger surfacing in him that Caleb recognized because he felt the same thing rising in his own chest, hot and unfamiliar. Whatever Deborah Ashford was trying to buy with that money, Caleb, she didn't get it. And Vivian paid for it anyway. In the one currency her stepmother never seems to run short of, handing out humiliation in front of an entire church. Caleb turned back to the window jaw, working the harbor lights blurring slightly in his vision. He thought of Deborah's voice. He had never met the woman, but Vivian had described enough of their conversations that he could imagine it easily, that particular register cruelty takes when it's dressed up as concern, telling her stepdaughter days after the wedding collapse that she let a good man walk away over some scene she'd made afterward. He thought of Dana standing in a chapel doorway informing Vivian she'd be lucky if a beggar off the street ever looked at her twice. He thought of a woman kneeling in a gutter, in a torn wedding dress, asking a stranger to marry her, because her own family had made certain deliberately and with apparent premeditation that she had nowhere else left to turn. I want to know why, Caleb said quietly. Not just that the money moved. Why? What Deborah Ashford needed badly enough to pay a man to marry her stepdaughter, and badly enough again, apparently, to let him walk away without consequence when he decided against it. I'm already on it. Give me another week, maybe 2. Walt hesitated, and something in his posture shifted, some old caution surfacing again despite the ground he and Caleb had covered these past weeks. There's one more thing. Not about the money. About you. Caleb turned from the window. You've been different since I brought you that photograph, Walt said carefully. The one from the hospital fund. I've known you 18 years, Caleb, and I've never once seen you hold something back from someone the way you're holding this back from her. You still haven't told her who you are. You still haven't told her who she was to you 11 years ago standing outside that store. I know. Why not? At this point, you know she's not running a con. You've had 3 weeks of proof. What's stopping you? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over the way. He turned over most things that frightened him slowly from several angles before he'd allow himself to answer honestly. Because right now, he said finally, she loves a man with nothing. No company, no name people recognize on a building downtown, nothing to offer her except himself exactly as he is. And some part of me, the part that spent 6 years in a house on Chestnut Street being told nobody keeps you unless somebody's paying for it, some part of me isn't ready to find out whether that changes the moment she learns what I actually have. He looked back out at the water, voice dropping lower. I know that's not fair to her. I know I owe her the truth, and soon before this goes any further. But I've spent my whole life being wanted for what I could provide Walt. Just once I wanted to know what it felt like to be wanted for nothing at all. Walt didn't answer right away. He simply stood across the small office and put a hand on his oldest friend's shoulder, the same gesture he'd been making since they were 17 years old, and broke together before either of them had anything worth protecting. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I don't think that changes with her. I've watched her give away things she couldn't afford to lose 3 times now without asking for a single thing back. But you're going to have to tell her, Caleb. Soon. Because whatever Deborah Ashford was buying with that $40,000, I've got a feeling it's connected to something bigger than one bad marriage. And when it comes out, and it will come out, I need you standing next to her as exactly who you are, not as a stranger she's about to discover she never actually knew. Caleb nodded slowly, the coffee going cold and forgotten on the desk between them, the harbor outside the window, dark and patient, and giving nothing away the way the whole city seemed to be waiting in those last quiet weeks of autumn for a truth that both men could feel gathering somewhere, just out of sight. Walt Briggs had spent 18 years learning how to read a balance sheet the way other men read weather for the small signs that told you a storm was coming before anyone else noticed the sky had changed. It was a skill that had served Whitcomb Maple well through 2 recessions and 1 hostile takeover attempt, and it was the same skill he brought now to the quiet, unglamorous work of finding out exactly what Deborah Ashford had been trying to buy for $40,000. It took him 10 days longer than he'd promised Caleb, and most of that time was spent in the unremarkable business of following money through the places money likes to hide: shell accounts, holding companies with names designed to mean nothing, a private lender in Montpelier that did not advertise, and did not, as a rule, speak to people who weren't already clients. He found his way in through a paralegal he'd once done a favor for, and what she pulled for him over a diner breakfast, 3 towns from Burlington where neither of them was likely to be recognized, finally gave the $40,000 a shape. Deborah Ashford's been in debt to Marcus Feld for going on 4 years, the paralegal said, sliding a folder across the table between them, the diner's fluorescent lights, making the printed numbers look starker than they probably were. Feld runs private lending mostly to people who can't get approved anywhere, legitimate anymore. High interest, worse terms if you're late. She originally borrowed against some renovation on the house kitchen, I think, from the paperwork, and it snowballed the way those things do. By this spring she owed him a little over $90,000 all in, and the $40,000 that went to Nolan Pierce. That's the part that took me a while to untangle because it wasn't structured like a loan payment. It moved from Deborah's account to Nolan's, then from Nolan's account 3 days before the wedding straight to Feld's holding company. The paralegal tapped the relevant line with one finger. Deborah needed a way to move money to Feld that wouldn't look like she was still drowning in debt to a man like that. A wedding gift to her future son-in-law quietly routed straight through to her creditor, clean on paper, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking hard enough to notice the timing. Walt sat back, turning it over. So the wedding wasn't really about Vivian at all. I can't speak to what was in anyone's heart, the paralegal said carefully, closing the folder. I can only tell you where the money went. But $40,000 is an unusual amount for a wedding gift, and it landing in a debt collector's account 3 days later is an even more unusual coincidence. Walt thanked her, paid for both their breakfasts, and drove back to Burlington with the folder on the passenger seat, replaying the whole way the particular cruelty of what he now understood. Deborah hadn't simply pressured her stepdaughter into a marriage of convenience. She had used that marriage as cover for moving money to a man who did not, from everything Walt had learned about people like Marcus Feld over the years, forgive debts easily or wait patiently for the rest, which meant Deborah's debt to Feld hadn't disappeared with the wedding. It had only lost the cover story that was supposed to make it invisible. He brought the folder to Caleb that evening, in the same small office 1 floor below the executive suite, and watched his oldest friend's face move through the same progression his own had 3 days earlier: disbelief, then a slow cold understanding, then something that looked less like anger and more like grief on someone else's behalf. She used her own stepdaughter, Caleb said finally, to launder a debt payment to a loan shark. That's how it reads to me. Walt spread the documents across the desk, the wire transfers laid out in order like a confession nobody had bothered to make out loud. And when Nolan found something better, richer family, better connections, whatever it was that pulled him away, he still walked off with the $40,000 intact. Which means Deborah's debt to Feld is exactly where it was before, except now she's got no wedding left to hide it behind. Does Vivian know any of this? Not from me. I don't think from anyone. Walt hesitated, the old caution returning to his voice. There's something else, Caleb. I wasn't looking for it, but it turned up while I was tracing Feld's holding company. He's not just a private lender. He's connected through 2 shell entities, but connected to a larger family trust. One that's funded a number of things over the years. Real estate, some restaurant investments. He paused, and something in his face made Caleb go still before the sentence finished. And going back about 15 years, a handful of unregulated group foster placements across the state. Underfunded operations, the kind that don't get much oversight because nobody's paying close attention to where the money for them actually comes from. Caleb felt something cold move through his chest, an old familiar dread surfacing from a place he hadn't visited in years. Which trust, he said quietly. I don't have it fully confirmed yet. I need another week, maybe 2, before I can tell you for certain whose name sits at the top of it. Walt's voice had gone careful, deliberate, the voice of a man choosing not to hand a loaded gun to a friend who hadn't slept properly in a month. I didn't want to bring you half of something this ugly. I wanted to be sure before I said the rest of it out loud. Say it anyway. Caleb. Say it, Walt. Caleb's voice had dropped, gone flat and dangerous in a way Walt had heard perhaps 3 times in 18 years of friendship. You've never once in your life sat on information because you were being careful with the facts. You're being careful with me. Which means you already suspect something and you're deciding whether I can handle hearing it. Walt was quiet for a long moment, the folder sitting open between them, the harbor lights outside the window doing nothing to soften the shape of what he had to say next. The trust traces back through 3 layers of shell entities I still need to peel apart, he said finally. But the name that keeps surfacing at the root of it, Caleb, the family whose money has been quietly running through Marcus Feld's operation, through Nolan Pierce's little inheritance story, and possibly through a group home 15 years ago that neither of us has any reason to think is a coincidence, is Pierce. Nolan's family. The same people whose son just left your fiancé at the altar for a better offer. The office went very quiet. Outside, a boat horn sounded once low and distant out on the black water, and neither man moved to break the silence that followed it. Caleb thought of a hallway that smelled like bleach. He thought of a man named Hollis lining up frightened children on their first morning in a house that was never a home, telling each one of them in the same flat, practiced voice that nobody keeps you because they want you. He thought of 18 years spent building an empire specifically so that no one could ever again make him feel the way that house had made him feel, and of how thin suddenly all of that armor felt against the possibility that the money behind his worst years and the money behind Vivian's worst morning might somehow impossibly trace back to the very same source. Find out, he said very quietly. All of it. However long it takes. I need to know exactly what we're standing in the middle of before this goes any further. And if it's what I think it might be, Walt asked. If it turns out the same family funded both of your worst years 15 years apart without either of you ever knowing the other existed until 3 weeks ago on a rain-soaked street, Caleb looked out at the water for a long time before he answered, his reflection faint and fractured in the dark glass. A man who had spent his whole adult life believing he'd already survived, the worst thing that could ever be done to him. Then I need to know before Vivian finds out some other way, he said. Because whatever this turns out to be, Walt, I am not going to be the reason she learns it from a stranger instead of from me. It took Walt 9 more days, and in the end it wasn't a shell company or a wire transfer that finally confirmed it, but something far more ordinary. A donor plaque photographed for a county archive project 2 decades earlier and long, since forgotten, showing a modest brass rectangle once mounted in the entryway of a group home on Chestnut Street, the Pierce Family Trust in service to Vermont's children. Walt stared at the photograph for a long time before he called Caleb. I need you to sit down again, he said. And Caleb, standing at the window of the small office, 1 floor below the executive suite, felt his stomach drop before Walt had said another word, because that sentence had already cost them both something once this month. Just tell me. The Pierce Family Trust funded Hollis House for 11 years, Walt said. Chestnut Street. Your Chestnut Street. I confirmed it against county placement records. The trust covered operating costs for the home from the year before you arrived until 3 years after you aged out. It wasn't a large line item for a family with their resources. Barely a rounding error, probably. But it was them, Caleb. The same family whose fortune your fiancé's stepmother has been laundering debt payments through. The same family whose son left her at the altar. Their money kept that house running. Their money kept Hollis employed. Their money, in a very real sense, was in the room every time that man told a 12-year-old boy that nobody keeps you unless somebody's paying for it. Caleb sat down slowly in the chair behind the desk, the office tilting slightly around him in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. They didn't run it. Walt added quickly, some instinct telling him the distinction mattered even now. There's no evidence anyone in the Pierce family ever set foot in that house or knew a single child's name. It was a line in a philanthropic ledger to them, probably. A tax deduction with a nice-sounding cause attached. That's very likely all it ever was to them. It wasn't a line item to me, Caleb said quietly. I know. Caleb sat with it for a long moment, the old familiar cold moving through his chest, the particular kind of grief that comes not from new information but from old wounds discovering they have new roots than anyone had ever traced before. He thought of Hollis's voice, flat and practiced, delivering the same speech to every new arrival. He thought of 6 years spent believing that speech, building a life afterward specifically to disprove it. And now somehow, the money that had kept that voice housed and fed and standing in that hallway belonged, however distantly, to the same family that had just humiliated the woman he loved in front of an entire church. "I have to tell her," he said finally. "All of it. Tonight." He found Vivian at the park where they always met, and something in his face must have told her before he said a word, because she was on her feet before he'd finished crossing the last few yards toward her. What happened? He told her everything. Not gently, not in careful pieces the way he'd told her about Hollis House weeks earlier, but all at once, because he'd decided somewhere on the walkover that she deserved the whole truth in one telling, rather than a slow drip, designed to soften it. The trust. The plaque. 11 years of funding that had kept a house running where a boy had been taught systematically that he was worth exactly what someone was willing to pay to keep him. Vivian went very still. "Pierce," she said, the word coming out barely above a whisper. "Nolan's family." Yes. The same family that paid Deborah's debt collector. The same family whose son stood me up in front of everyone I've ever known. She had wrapped her arms around herself, some old instinct for self-protection surfacing, and Caleb watched her retreat somewhere behind her own eyes even as she stood 2 feet away from him. "Their money helped hurt you. When you were 12 years old. Before either of us had any idea the other existed. Vivian, this isn't your fault. You didn't choose that family. You were a child yourself when I was engaged to their son." Her voice had gone tight, shaking now in a way it hadn't since the morning she'd first found him on Maple Street. "I sat at their table. I let Deborah parade me in front of them like I was something worth trading. I have no idea what else that money touched, Caleb, what else it bought or buried or made possible, and I have no idea how you're supposed to look at me and not see all of it standing behind me every time you do. That's not what I see. How could it not be?" Something raw and frightened had crept into her voice now, the particular panic of a person watching a good thing become suddenly unbearably complicated. "You told me about that house like it was the worst thing that ever happened to you. And now you're standing here telling me the people who nearly married me funded it. I don't know how a person is supposed to hold both of those things at once and still want to be near me. Vivian, I need to think." She was already stepping back from him, arms still wrapped tight around herself. Something final in the set of her shoulders that frightened him more than anything Dale Pruitt or Deborah Ashford had ever said within his hearing. "Please, I need a little time. I need to figure out how to feel about my own family's money without feeling like I'm the one who put it there." She left before he could find the words to stop her, walking quickly back toward the streetlights at the park's edge, and Caleb stood alone in the deepening cold, watching her go, understanding with a sick, sinking certainty that the very thing he'd feared, telling her not the truth about who he was but the truth about what had shaped him, had somehow, despite every careful word, driven her further away than his silence ever had. Walt found him there 20 minutes later, still standing in the same spot, hands jammed in his coat pockets against a cold that had nothing left to prove to him. "That bat, she needs time," Caleb said, and the words tasted like ash. "Which is fair. Which is more than fair, actually, given what I just handed her." He turned to look at his oldest friend, something hollowed out and exhausted in his face that Walt hadn't seen since the year Ruth Whitcomb died. "I spent 18 years building a life specifically so I'd never again feel like the kid in that hallway being told he wasn't worth keeping. And I just watched the one person who's ever made me feel otherwise walk away because the truth was too heavy to stand next to." She didn't walk away, Caleb. She asked for time. "There's a difference even if it doesn't feel like one tonight. Doesn't it, though?" Caleb's voice cracked slightly, something old and unhealed surfacing beneath the exhaustion. "Isn't that exactly how it always starts? Somebody needs a little time and then a little more, and eventually there's no time left at all, just an empty room and a story you tell yourself about why." Walt didn't have an answer for that, not one that would land, not tonight, not against 18 years of a wound that ran deeper than either of them had fully reckoned with until this month. He simply stood beside his oldest friend in the cold the way he had a dozen times before, offering the only thing he had left to give presence, without pretending it was enough to fix what had just cracked open between two people who had, until an hour ago, believed they were finally building something that might hold. 3 days passed and Caleb did not go looking for her. It cost him more than almost anything he'd done in 18 years of careful, disciplined restraint. The sitting still, the not calling, the not walking the 4 blocks to her apartment and knocking until she opened the door. But he had learned enough about Vivian Ashford in the past month to know that she had spent her whole life being told what to feel by people who had no right to tell her anything, and he would not, whatever it cost him, become one more voice crowding into a decision that had to be hers alone. Walt, who had no such restraint and considerably less patience, took to watching over her, instead quietly at a distance. The same careful surveillance he'd once turned on her out of suspicion now turned toward something closer to the protectiveness, though he never told Caleb exactly how far he'd taken it. It was on the third evening from the window of a coffee shop across the street from her apartment building that he saw her come out into the cold wearing a coat too thin for the weather, carrying a grocery bag that didn't look heavy enough to be worth the trip. He almost let it go. Then he saw where she was walking, and something made him follow at a distance instead. She crossed 2 blocks toward a squat brick building with a keypad entry system where an elderly man stood on the front steps in his shirt sleeves, patting down his pockets with the particular mounting panic of someone who has just realized his keys are on the wrong side of a locked door. It was cold enough that Walt could see the man's breath, cold enough that the old man's hands had gone visibly stiff and clumsy as he tried uselessly a second and third time to find keys that clearly weren't there. Vivian didn't hesitate. Walt watched her cross the street, watched her speak to the man he couldn't hear the words. From where he stood, only saw the shape of the conversation, saw the old man's shoulders sag with relief and embarrassment in roughly equal measure. She sat down beside him on the cold concrete steps, rather than leaving him there alone while she called the building superintendent. And when the call went to voicemail, she didn't leave. She stayed still in her thin coat, offering the old man half the contents of her grocery bag: bread, an apple, something wrapped in wax paper. Walt couldn't identify from across the street talking to him in a low, steady voice, while they both waited nearly 40 minutes for someone with a spare key to arrive. There was no one filming it. No one watching as far as she knew. Nothing to be gained from any of it, except an old man made slightly less miserable on a cold evening, and a woman who had every reason after the last 3 days to keep whatever she had left for herself, giving it away instead to a stranger who couldn't offer her a single thing in return. Walt stood in the doorway of the coffee shop for a long time after the superintendent finally arrived, and let the old man back inside, watching Vivian gather her now lighter grocery bag and walk on toward her own apartment alone in the deepening cold without once looking around to see if anyone had noticed what she'd done. He had spent a month looking for the crack in her, the angle, the tell that would confirm what 18 years of protecting Caleb Whitcomb had trained him to expect from anyone who got close enough to matter. He had found $40,000 moving through her stepmother's accounts, a family trust with blood on its hands, going back 15 years, a fiancé who'd sold her out for a better offer, every ugly thing that had ever touched, her life laid bare across a month of careful digging. And not once in any of it had he found a single thing that was actually hers to be ashamed of. He found Caleb that night in the same small office still, working long past the hour any sane person would have gone home, the harbor lights doing their usual slow shimmer against the black water outside the window. "I need to tell you something," Walt said, "and I need you to actually hear it this time instead of just waiting for me to finish so you can go back to being miserable." Caleb looked up, something wary in his face, braced for one more piece of ugly news added to the pile. "I followed her tonight," Walt said. I know, I'll apologize to her for it eventually if she ever wants to hear it. But I needed to see something with my own eyes instead of reading it off a bank statement." He sat down across from his oldest friend, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, the way he did when he had something he genuinely needed Caleb to absorb rather than simply hear. "She spent 40 minutes tonight sitting on cold concrete steps with a stranger who'd locked himself out of his building, giving away half her groceries to a man she'd never met before, with absolutely nobody watching and nothing whatsoever to gain from it." Caleb didn't say anything, but something in his shoulders shifted, some of the careful bracing easing slightly. "I've spent a month trying to find the version of her that's calculating something," Walt went on. "The version that's angling for your money or your name or some advantage I haven't uncovered yet. I told myself I was being thorough, careful, doing my job." He shook his head slowly. "But I think the truth is, I didn't want to believe a person could be exactly what she looks like, because if she is, then I spent 18 years watching you get told you weren't worth keeping. And it turns out the world does actually make people capable of proving that wrong. I just never happened to meet one before." Walt, she didn't choose her stepmother's debts, Caleb. She didn't choose which family's trust ended up funding Hollis House 15 years before she was even old enough to understand what a trust was. She spent her whole life being handed other people's messes and asked to carry them, and every time I've watched, every time you've told me about, she's chosen kindness anyway, even when it costs her something she can't afford to lose. Walt's voice had gone rough. unfamiliar with this kind of sincerity, but he pushed through it anyway. She's not the money that touched your childhood, Caleb. She's the woman who tried to save your mother's life before she ever knew you existed, and who's been trying to save something in you ever since without asking a single time what it costs her to keep doing it. Don't lose her over a debt she never signed her name to. Caleb sat with that for a long moment, the office quiet around them, the city outside the window carrying on the way. Cities do indifferent to the small, enormous things happening inside any one of its buildings on any given night. She asked for time, he said, finally quietly. I told myself I'd give her exactly as much as she needed, even if it's more than I can stand. Then give her the time, Walt said. But don't disappear while you're doing it. There's a difference between giving someone room and letting them think you've already decided to let go. He stood across the small distance between them and put a hand on Caleb's shoulder, the same gesture he'd been making for 18 years since two broke boys with nothing had decided to build something out of sap lines and stubbornness. Go find her tomorrow. Not to push her, just to let her see your face and know you're still standing exactly where she left you. Caleb looked up at his oldest friend, the man who had spent a month searching for reasons to distrust the person Caleb loved, and had instead, without either of them quite planning it, found the clearest proof yet of exactly who she really was. Thank you, Caleb said, for seeing it, for telling me even after everything. That's the job, Walt said, echoing words he'd said a month earlier in this same office, though something in his voice now carried none of the old suspicion it once had. Somebody's got to keep both feet on the ground. Turns out this time the ground held better than I expected. The invitation had been sitting on Caleb's desk for 3 weeks, embossed and untouched, a date circled by his assistant in the kind of careful red ink reserved for things a chairman could not, under any circumstances, miss twice. Whitcomb Maple Co., 14th Annual Founders Gala. The board had already rescheduled it once quietly without explanation, while their chairman remained unreachable for reasons nobody outside Walt Briggs's office was permitted to know. He couldn't disappear a second time. Even Walt agreed on that much. 9 days, Walt said, laying the schedule out on the desk between them like a battle map. Every major investor in 3 states will be in that ballroom. The state's own commerce secretary is coming. If you don't show up as yourself this time, Caleb, there's no story we can spin that survives it. I know. I also think, Walt added more carefully now, watching his friend's face for the reaction he half expected, that it's time. Not just because the board needs it. Because you need it. 18 years of hiding half of yourself from everyone who might actually love the whole of you. That's long enough, don't you think? Caleb didn't answer right away. He was thinking of Vivian 3 days into the silence she'd asked. For 3 days he had spent honoring, even as every instinct in him screamed to close the distance between them. He hadn't heard from her since the night by the water. He told himself that was fair. He told himself a great many reasonable things in the small hours that did nothing to loosen the knot sitting permanently now in his chest. If I do this, he said slowly, if I walk into that gala as myself in front of everyone, I need her there. Not as a surprise, not as a stunt for the cameras. I need to ask her first honestly whether she wants to stand next to whatever I actually am. Then go ask her, Walt said. Today. Not through me. Not through a note. Go stand on her doorstep and say it to her face the way you should have said everything else a month ago. She opened the door before he'd finished knocking a second time, as if she'd been standing just on the other side of it, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. 3 days had done something to both of them. Caleb had lost the careful composure he usually wore even in his ragged coat, and Vivian looked like a woman who had spent 72 hours turning the same impossible math over and over, without ever arriving at an answer that satisfied her. I'm not here to push you, Caleb said before she could speak. I promised myself I wouldn't, and I'm keeping that promise. I just need you to know something, whatever you decide. Okay, there's an event. 9 days from now. People I've spent 18 years building something with, expecting to finally see the man behind all of it. He held her gaze steady, though his voice wavered slightly on what came next. I'm going to walk in there as exactly who I am, Vivian. No more coat, no more test, no more careful distance between the man on Maple Street and the name on the building. And I would rather walk in there alone than walk in there with anyone except you standing beside me, but only if that's still something you want. Not because of anything I can give you. Because of everything you've already given me without knowing what it would cost you. Vivian's eyes had filled, though she didn't let the tears fall, standing very straight in her doorway. The way he'd learned this past month was her particular way of holding herself together. I've spent 3 days, she said quietly, trying to figure out how to feel about money. I never touched funding a house I never knew existed, hurting a boy I wouldn't meet for another 15 years. and I kept arriving at the same place over and over no matter how many times I turned it around. She stepped closer, close enough now that he could see exactly how tired she was, how little those 3 days had actually rested her. It was never about the money, Caleb. It was never about the Pierces or Deborah or any of it. It was about whether I trusted you enough to sit inside something ugly together instead of running from it separately. And I do. I think I have since the moment you sat down next to me on those steps and let me see how much that house still hurt you all these years later. Vivian, I want to be there, she said before he could say anything else. At your gala. Standing next to whoever you actually are, chairman, beggar, orphan, all of it at once. I don't care what name is on the building. I didn't fall in love with a coat, Caleb. I fell in love with a man who sat with me in the rain, and never once made me feel small for asking a stranger to marry me. That man doesn't disappear just because the rest of the world finally gets to see him. He crossed the last few feet between them and kissed her. Then on her doorstep in the cold afternoon light, 3 days of silence, and a month of secrets finally collapsing into something simple and whole. The days that followed moved faster than either of them expected. Walt threw himself into preparations with the particular ferocity of a man determined to get one thing exactly right after a month of getting so much else so painfully wrong. Coordinating with the board, drafting the language of an announcement that would need to explain carefully and publicly, both, who Caleb truly was and what had been quietly uncovered about the Pierce family trust and Deborah Ashford's debts. Vivian, for her part, spent the week doing something she hadn't done in a month, sleeping through full nights, laughing at small things, allowing herself cautiously to imagine a future that didn't feel like it might be pulled out from under her at any moment. She told no one where she was going the evening before the gala, not even Deborah, who had called twice that week, with a voice gone strangely conciliatory. Sensing perhaps that something had shifted in the ground beneath her stepdaughter's feet that she no longer fully understood. On the morning of the event, Caleb stood in front of a mirror in a tailored suit for the first time in a month, clean-shaven his own face, looking back at him rather than the careful ruin he'd worn on Maple Street, and felt a strange vertigo standing there. Not quite fear, not quite relief. Something closer to the sensation of stepping finally out of a doorway he'd been standing in for 18 years. You look like yourself again, Walt said from the doorway, adjusting his own cufflinks. I don't know if that's a compliment or not, given everything you just watched me put a good woman through this past month. It's both, Walt said simply. You're allowed to be both things, Caleb. The man who built all this, and the boy who still needs to hear every so often that he was worth keeping all along. He clapped a hand on his oldest friend's shoulder, the old gesture steady as it had ever been. Let's go stand you up in front of the whole state, and finally let them see it. Caleb nodded, straightened his jacket and walked out to meet the car, waiting to take him to the one night that would finally close the distance between the man everyone believed they knew and the man he had spent a lifetime and a rain-soaked morning on Maple Street becoming. The ballroom at the Lakeview Hotel had been decorated the same way it was every year. White linens, maple leaves carved from ice slowly weeping onto silver trays. A string quartet working through something classical and forgettable near the bar. What was different this year, though, nobody in the room yet understood. Why was the current running underneath the small talk? A restlessness that had been building for a month among investors and board members who had grown accustomed to a chairman who simply vanished each spring and returned eventually without ever explaining where he'd been. Deborah Ashford arrived at 7:15, Dana on her arm, both of them dressed for a room they still believed they belonged in, still hoping in the particular way people hope when they've never had to reckon with real consequences, that enough time had passed for the wedding scandal to have quietly lost its edge. There, Deborah murmured to Dana, nodding toward the entrance where a small crowd had begun to gather with the particular electricity of people sensing something was about to happen. I told you it would blow over. Nobody even remembers. She stopped mid-sentence. Caleb Whitcomb walked into the ballroom in a tailored suit, clean-shaven, unmistakably himself with Walt Briggs. A step behind him and Vivian Ashford on his arm in a deep green gown that had nothing torn or borrowed about it. The room's noise dropped by half. Almost instantly, a wave of recognition rippling outward from the door. That's him. That's Whitcomb. Wait, isn't that? And Deborah felt the champagne glass in her hand go suddenly dangerously unsteady. That's not possible, she said very quietly to no one. It was unmistakably possible. Vivian watched her stepmother's face do something she had genuinely never seen it do before. Go entirely, completely blank, every carefully constructed layer of composure falling away at once, replaced by naked, uncomprehending shock. Caleb didn't rush. He crossed the room slowly, shaking hands he needed to shake, accepting the startled congratulations of board members who had spent a month wondering whether their chairman had finally lost his mind, until he reached the small stage at the room's far end and took the microphone from an assistant who hadn't been told until that exact moment what he intended to say. Most of you know me as a man who disappears every spring, he began, and the room went fully silent, 300 people leaning in without quite meaning to. For 8 years I've told the board it was personal business. That was true as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole truth, and I think it's time it was. He told them. Not everything, not Hollis House, not the particular cruelty of a caseworker's voice in a hallway that smelled like bleach, but enough. A boy who'd lost his mother young, who'd learned early what it felt like to be treated as disposable, who had built from a single roadside sap stand, an empire specifically so that no one could ever again make him feel small, and who had spent every spring since then deliberately putting himself back into the position of having nothing, just to find out whether the world had gotten any kinder to people who looked like he once had. A month ago he said I was sitting on Maple Street in the rain, in a coat that wasn't mine, when a woman walked up to me in a torn wedding dress and asked me to marry her. She had no idea who I was. She'd just been left at the altar by her fiancé, and told by her own family that she'd be lucky if a beggar off the street would still have her. He found Vivian's eyes across the room, and something in his voice steadied on the words that came next. She didn't know it, but that wasn't the first time she'd tried to save something of mine. 11 years earlier, she emptied every dollar she had into a hospital fund for a woman named Ruth Whitcomb, my mother. She never met me. She never learned my name. She simply saw a family in trouble and gave everything she had twice 11 years apart without ever once asking what it would cost her to do it. A murmur moved through the crowd, disbelief, and something warmer tangled together. Near the back, Deborah had gone very still, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, some cold understanding beginning to dawn on her face as Caleb kept speaking. "There's one more thing this room deserves to know," he said, and his voice hardened slightly now, the warmth giving way to something more deliberate. The reason Nolan Pierce left Vivian Ashford at the altar wasn't cold feet or a better offer he stumbled into by chance. It was a $40,000 payment wired to him 9 days before the wedding by her stepmother, Deborah Ashford, disguised as a wedding gift, and used to quietly settle a private debt Deborah had been unable to pay any other way. Mr. Pierce took that money, found a wealthier arrangement elsewhere, and left without a word of explanation, leaving Vivian to answer publicly and alone for a betrayal that was never hers to carry. Caleb finished, and let the silence that followed sit exactly as long as it needed to. Deborah did not try to defend herself. She simply set her champagne glass down on the nearest table with a hand that had begun visibly to shake, and walked without a word to anyone toward the ballroom's side exit, Dana trailing behind her with the stunned, hollowed-out expression of a woman watching her entire understanding of her family come apart in a room full of strangers. Nobody stopped them. Nobody needed to. The truth, once spoken aloud in front of 300 witnesses, it would do the rest of the work on its own. In the weeks that followed, the quiet unraveling of investor confidence in whatever remained of Nolan Pierce's fabricated fortune, the fraud investigation that would eventually catch up with him, in a city 2 states away, the slow, humiliating collapse of a debt Deborah could no longer disguise as anything but exactly what it was. Caleb stepped down from the small stage into a room still murmuring with the shock of it, but he wasn't looking at the board members reaching to shake his hand or the reporters already typing notes into their phones. He was looking for Vivian, and found her near the edge of the crowd, her eyes bright with tears she hadn't quite let fall, one hand pressed flat against her chest as if she were holding something in place that might otherwise come loose. He didn't get the chance to reach her. An elderly man in a plain gray suit had appeared at the edge of the room, standing somewhat apart from the gala's glittering crowd, watching Caleb with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for the right moment to approach. Walt saw him first and went very still, recognition moving across his face before he crossed quickly to Caleb's side. "That's him," Walt said quietly, urgently close to Caleb's ear. "The chaplain, from Fanning Hospice. I found him 3 weeks ago, Caleb. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, and then everything with Deborah happened, and I didn't want to add one more thing to what you were already carrying. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner." Told me what? Walt didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the man in the gray suit who had begun slowly to make his way across the room. The chaplain's name was Arthur Kessler, and he introduced himself with the quiet, careful formality of a man who had spent 40 years delivering difficult news to people at the worst moments of their lives, and had learned long ago that gentleness cost nothing, and often mattered more than anything else he had to offer. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, "I served as chaplain at Fanning Hospice for many years. I was there the night your mother passed." Something in Caleb's chest went very still. "She asked me to hold on to something for her." Kessler continued drawing a worn envelope from inside his jacket, its edges soft with age. Caleb's name written across the front in handwriting. He recognized instantly, viscerally in a way, that made the entire crowded ballroom seem suddenly very far away. A letter. "She made me promise I wouldn't give it to you as a child. She was afraid, given everything that was happening with your father at the time, that it might not be safe for you to have it then. She asked me to wait until you were a grown man established enough in your own life that no one could use it to hurt either of you anymore. I've carried it a long time, Mr. Whitcomb, waiting for the right moment. I saw your name in the paper last week connected to this event, and I hoped the time had finally come." Caleb's hands were not entirely steady as he took the envelope. "There's something else," Kessler said, more gently now. "Alongside the letter, I was asked to give you this." He produced a second, smaller document, a formal county record, and Caleb saw, even before he'd fully unfolded it, that it bore an official seal considerably older than his own memory of the story he'd been told as a boy. "This is the corrected custody record filed years after the fact, once certain other matters came to light. I believe you were told growing up that your mother relinquished custody near the end. That isn't what actually happened. I think you should read it for yourself before I say anything more." Caleb opened the envelope with hands that had built an empire, negotiated with bankers twice his age, and had never once in 18 years trembled the way they were trembling now. His mother's handwriting filled 2 pages, careful and small, the handwriting of a woman who had known writing it that these might be among the last words she ever gave her son. She wrote that she loved him more than anything she had ever been given in her own difficult life. She wrote that she had never, not for one single day, considered giving him up, that the story he might one day be told if certain people had their way would be a lie, manufactured to protect someone else, and that she needed him to know the truth, even if it took years to reach him. She had been fleeing his biological father, a man capable of far more cruelty than a 12-year-old should ever have to understand, when the accident happened that ultimately led to her diagnosis worsening beyond recovery. She had been trying in her last months of real strength to get Caleb somewhere safe, somewhere his father's money and influence couldn't reach either of them. His father, in the aftermath, had used exactly that money and influence to alter the record, to ensure it read as abandonment, rather than the truth, protecting himself from any scrutiny of what he'd driven her to. "You were never given away," the letter ended. "You were fought for every single day I had left. I am only sorry I ran out of days before I could tell you myself. Whatever you become, whoever you let love you, please, Caleb, let yourself believe you are always worth the fighting." Caleb stood in the middle of the ballroom, the gala's murmuring crowd receding into something distant and unimportant, and read the letter a second time, and then a third, something in his chest that had been sealed shut since he was 12 years old, finally, after 18 years, beginning to come apart. Vivian was beside him before he fully registered her crossing the room. She didn't ask what the letter said. She didn't try to read it over his shoulder, or offer any of the easy reassurances people reach for in moments too large for words. She simply put her hand over his the way she had once on a rain-soaked street corner, and stayed there while he shook silently in the middle of a room full of people who had no idea they were witnessing the exact moment an 18-year-old wound finally, truly began to close. "She never gave you up," Vivian said softly when he could finally speak again, her own voice thick with tears that had stopped waiting for permission to fall. "You were never nobody's Caleb, not for one single day of your life." "I believed it," he said, his voice breaking properly now for the first time since she'd known him. 18 years, Vivian. I believed every word that man in that house ever told me, because it was easier than hoping for something different. I know." She pulled him gently toward her, and he led her right there in the middle of the ballroom, in front of the board and the reporters and the string quartet that had quietly stopped playing. "You don't have to believe it alone anymore. That's not how this works from here on out." Around them, the room had gone hushed, sensing, even without understanding the particulars, that they were watching something far more important than a corporate gala unfold in front of them. A man who had spent his entire adult life proving to the world he was worth keeping, finally in the arms of the Crotida. One person who had never once needed the proof to know it was already true. The gala did not end that night the way galas usually end, with polite applause and a slow drift toward the coat check. It ended with 300 people standing in near silence, watching a billionaire cry openly in the arms of a woman in a green gown. And somehow, in the days that followed that image, not the fraud charges against Nolan Pierce, not the quiet collapse of Deborah Ashford's finances, Not even the astonishing story of a beggar who turned out to be a chairman became the thing Burlington couldn't stop talking about. Not the reveal, the tenderness underneath it. A week later, on a Saturday morning, bright with the kind of hard, clean cold that only comes to Vermont once autumn has fully surrendered to winter, Caleb drove Vivian out past the edge of town, past roads she hadn't traveled in 6 years, until the truck slowed in front of a small farmhouse with a sugar bush rising behind it, trees she recognized impossibly achingly as her father's. "It's yours," Caleb said before she could ask. "It's been yours for weeks now. I should have told you the day it happened, but I wanted you to see it standing, not just hear about it in a sentence." Vivian walked the property in silence for a long time, her hand trailing along fence posts her father had built with his own hands, and when she finally turned back to Caleb standing by the truck with his hands in his pockets, uncertain for, once in his life, what to do with himself, she didn't say anything about the money or the gesture or what it must have cost him. She simply walked back across the frozen grass and kissed him long and unhurried, in the exact spot where her father used to stand every spring watching the first sap run. "I would have loved you with nothing," she told him. "You know that." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why it had to be you." They were married the following spring in a small stone chapel, not unlike the one Vivian had walked out of a year earlier in a torn wedding dress, though this time there was no empty seat at the front, no 6-word text arriving to end everything before it began. Walt stood beside Caleb, as best man the way he had stood beside him through 18 years of building something out of nothing. And when the pastor asked if anyone objected to the union, the only sound in the small chapel was the wind moving gently through trees just beginning to bud outside the windows. Deborah did not attend. That door for now remained closed, though Vivian left it unlocked, quietly hopeful that time and honesty might someday do what confrontation alone never could. Some wounds she had learned this past year take longer to close than others, and some are not hers to force open before they're ready. What Caleb and Vivian built together in the years that followed was not simply a marriage but something closer to a shared understanding, hard-won by both of them, of what it actually means to love someone all the way down to the truth of who they are. Caleb never stopped his yearly disappearances entirely, though they changed in nature, becoming less a test of the world's capacity for kindness and more a deliberate ongoing act of remembering where he came from, so that the empire he'd built would never let him forget the boy who once sat cold and hungry on a sidewalk wondering if anyone would ever see him as more than what he had. He funded quietly, and without his name attached the renovation of 3 group homes across Vermont, including eventually a complete rebuilding of the house on Chestnut Street, staffed this time with people trained to say the opposite of everything Hollis had ever told a frightened 12-year-old on his first morning there. And there is something in this story, if you have followed it this far, worth carrying with you long after the credits roll. It is this, that the people who show us kindness when we have nothing to offer in return are showing us something true about who we actually are, not who we appear to be in that moment. Vivian never knew, kneeling in the rain on Maple Street, that the man she proposed to could have bought the entire block they were standing on. She only knew he hadn't laughed and hadn't walked away, and in a morning when everyone else had, that was enough to build a life on. Kindness offered without knowing what it will cost or whether it will ever be repaid is the rarest and most valuable currency any of us will ever spend, rarer than money and worth infinitely more in the end. It is this, too, that the stories we're told about ourselves as children, that we are unwanted, that we are only kept because someone is paying for the privilege, that love is conditional on our usefulness. Those stories can live in us for decades, shaping every decision, every fear, every wall we build around our own hearts long after the people who told them to us are gone. And it takes something enormous sometimes to finally unmake them. It took Caleb 18 years, a small brick house that never should have been allowed to operate the way it did, and one letter carried faithfully by a stranger for nearly 2 decades, to finally learn that he had never once been unwanted at all, that his mother had fought for him with everything she had right up until the day she no longer could. Whatever wound you may be carrying from your own childhood, whatever voice still tells you that you were only ever kept because someone had to, it is worth asking, gently and honestly, whether that voice was ever actually telling you the truth. And it is this, finally, that healing rarely comes from grand gestures alone. It doesn't come from the wealth or the reveal or the public reckoning that finally holds the guilty accountable, satisfying as all of that might be to witness. It comes more often from someone simply choosing to stay through the ugliest revelations, through the moments that would give anyone reason to walk away, through silence and shaking hands and letters that take 18 years to arrive. Vivian never once tried to fix Caleb's pain or talk him out of feeling it or rush him towards some tidier version of healing. She just sat beside him again and again and let him fall apart in front of her without flinching. That more than any fortune either of them ever had turned out to be the thing that finally healed him. So here is the question this story leaves you with, and I would genuinely love to know your answer. What is the lesson you're walking away with today? Was it Vivian's kindness given without any expectation of return? Was it Caleb's courage choosing to be truly seen after a lifetime of hiding? Was it Walt's honesty, admitting he was wrong, and standing by his friend anyway? Or was it something else, entirely? Something in this story that touched a part of your own life you didn't expect it to reach? Whatever it was, I would love to hear it. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with me and with everyone else. Watching your reflection might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if this story moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, leave a comment, and subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you again in the next video.